Hi, this is the review for Unit 11, Ecological Interactions. I will be going through the learning objectives on page 163, so if you would like to follow along with me, you can go to that page. Objective 1 says, describe the trophic structure of an ecosystem and recognize examples of each trophic level. When we're talking about the trophic structure of an ecosystem, it's a way of organizing the community based on the feeding relationships of the organisms found there. Each organism within a community has a different feeding level, and we can look at those different feeding levels or trophic levels in this table here. So first, what you can see here are what are called producers. Producers produce all the food that is needed in that ecosystem. And producers, therefore, can make their own food, and they usually make their own food through photosynthesis. Examples of producers would include things like plants or phytoplankton. These are things that actually produce food through photosynthesis. Notice producers are also autotrophs. Autotroph means they make their own food. All the other trophic levels are heterotrophs. Let's look at the next trophic level. That is the primary consumers. So primary consumers consume the producers. So that is what they're eating. Examples of primary consumers include things like mice, many insects, deer, etc. Anything really that feeds on vegetation. So this could include things like herbivores. Also, many omnivores will eat both vegetation and meat. Organisms that eat the primary consumers are called secondary consumers. So these would be carnivores and also omnivores. Examples of a secondary consumer could be, for example, a wolf or a fox, snakes, etc. Organisms that eat secondary consumers would be called tertiary consumers. Examples of these could be things like hawks that eat the snakes. So these are the main trophic levels found within an ecosystem. However, there's also another trophic level that is vital for an ecosystem because its role is recycling the matter throughout that ecosystem or recycling the atoms. And these are called decomposers. Decomposers break down dead things or decaying things. So anything that eats something that's already dead or already decaying is called a decomposer. The most important decomposers in an ecosystem are usually bacteria and fungi. But also important decomposers in an ecosystem include things like worms, and any type of scavenger such as a vulture would be considered a decomposer. Another thing that I want to point out here is that some organisms can actually act at more than one trophic level. For example, when an owl eats a mouse, it is a secondary consumer because the mouse is a primary consumer. However, if I were to be talking about when the owl eats a snake that eats a mouse, then the owl in that situation would be a tertiary consumer. So an owl can be both a secondary consumer and a tertiary consumer within an ecosystem, and it all depends on which feeding relationship you're looking at or focusing on. So let's do an example here. A lot of times we can look at trophic structures by looking at food webs. Food webs display the feeding relationships among the organisms in a community. So here's a small food web drawn here. Notice the arrows are pointing in the direction in which the energy is moving. Okay, the energy is going in that direction. So if we look here, which of the organisms in this food web are producers? So it would be anything that photosynthesizes, and that would be wildflowers and grass. What about those that are primary consumers? Well, so that would be whatever feeds on the producers, and we can see that is the rabbit and the mouse. Secondary consumers feed on the primary consumers. So what is feeding on the mouse and the rabbits? Well, both the snake and the hawk are. So both of those are secondary consumers. Are there any tertiary consumers here? Well, there is one organism here that also is feeding on a secondary consumer. So the hawk also feeds on the snake. So the hawk in this case is both a secondary and tertiary consumer within this food web. So you should be able to pick out the trophic levels based on a food web like this, or based on a description. So we could describe a feeding relationship, and then you should be able to identify what trophic level each organism belongs to. Objective 2 says recognize the consequences of the competitive exclusion principle in graphs of population size for populations in competition for limited resources. And objective 3 is related to this, and it says describe the niche of a population and distinguish niche from habitat. Since these two objectives are related to each other and both talk about niche and competition, we will cover these two objectives together. And one of the most difficult things for a student to do is distinguish between niche and habitat. And so before we get into anything else, let's define what a niche is and what a habitat is. So a niche is defined as the ecological role of a species in its environment. So this thing would include everything that species needs to survive. The niche of a species includes both biotic and abiotic factors. Biotic factors, bio, this prefix means living, so biotic factors are any living factors that an organism might need to survive. This may include things like prey, competitors, and mates, so these are all living things. Abiotic factors, which make up a niche, are all the non-living factors that an organism needs to survive. This includes things like space, water, certain temperatures, humidity, shelter, and the time of day in which they're active. When organisms have different niches, they can coexist really easily because they're not in competition with each other. However, if organisms' niches overlap too much or they have very similar requirements in surviving, then they're going to start competing a lot for those different resources. So let's look at some examples or components of a niche. So these are just some examples. There are many parts of a niche, but let's just look at some of the most common ones. So for example, a niche may include the time of day in which an organism is active. So this could be diurnal versus nocturnal. For example, bats and birds, both of them are occupying the air. That's where they feed or where they travel around. However, they don't really compete with each other because birds tend to mostly be active during the day, whereas most bats are active during the night, so they're nocturnal. The type of food an organism needs would be a component of its niche. For example, one organism might feed on grasses, another organism might feed on insects. Well, these two species wouldn't be in competition with each other because they're feeding on different things. The amount of rainfall an organism needs, that is important for its niche, for it to survive. The temperature that it needs to survive would be important. The space that it requires within a habitat is extremely important. So this word habitat, what this is referring to is the actual physical space that an organism occupies. And it's more general. When we talk about habitat, we're talking about kind of the general area where this organism is living. So for example, some organisms might live in a pond habitat, some might live in a forest habitat, desert habitat, sand habitat, some might live in the soil, and so forth. However, within this habitat or this more general space, a species could have a different niche or specific location within that habitat where it lives. For example, niches can be part of a habitat. If we were looking at the habitat of a pond, for instance, there might be one organism that lives in the actual pond water and swims around in the water, so that would be its niche within that area of that pond. Whereas another species might actually feed and live in the mud at the bottom of the pond. So although both of those species would be occupying the same habitat, they have different niches in that habitat so they can coexist. So let's look at another example here. So these birds all have different feeding niches within a shoreline habitat. So although they're both living in a very similar habitat or feeding in a similar habitat, they can coexist because they each feed on something slightly different within that habitat. The main thing to kind of point out here is that organisms can share a habitat, but they can't share a niche within that habitat. Let's look at another example here. The birds have different niches in the same spruce habitat. So all these birds live within spruce trees. However, these different species of warbler can coexist because each one feeds in different levels of the spruce trees. So they're not in competition with each other very much. However, when two organisms require the exact same resources simultaneously, or their niches overlap to an extreme level, they are said to be in competition with one another. And if those niches are exactly identical, so all the requirements they need to survive are identical, then refers to what we call the competitive exclusion principle. This principle states that no two species can share the exact same niche in the exact same habitat. One species will go extinct and the other will outcompete the other one. Objective 4 says recognize the effects of predation in graphs of prey population size and note the role of predators in maintaining balance in biological communities. You looked a lot at predator-prey relationships when you looked at the interaction between moose and wolves in Isle Royale. And a couple of things that you want to notice in this graph is, one, whenever the moose population wasn't experiencing any pressure from predators, its carrying capacity was around 600 individuals. However, when the wolves were introduced to the island or came into the picture here, you can see the moose population decreased, and you can see that both the moose and the wolf population are oscillating. And some important things you want to notice about this interaction is that the predator and prey populations oscillate asynchronously with each other, with the predator population always lagging behind the prey population. So without even having these two lines labeled, you should be able to pick out the predator and the prey. And that is because the predator population is always going to rise and fall after the prey population. So notice here, the prey population increases. And because now that there's more moose available for the wolves, the wolf population increases. However, the wolf population increases to a certain point where now it's feeding on too many of the moose. And so since the moose population has started to decrease, the wolf population will start to decrease. So see how the moose population decreases and then the wolf population decreases. The moose population increases and then the wolf population increases. So the predator follows the prey. The predator population size is usually smaller than the prey population size too. So notice that the average moose population is around 200 individuals here, whereas the average wolf population is somewhere probably around like 50 individuals. So why is that? This all has to come down to the fact that lower trophic levels have more energy available to them. So the moose have more energy available to them so their population size can get larger. Whereas higher trophic levels in an ecosystem have less food available to them. So the wolves have less energy as a whole available to them, so their population size is always going to be slightly lower than the prey population. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about ecological pyramids. So one other thing I want to talk about is how do predators affect the health of prey populations or maintain a balance within an ecosystem? Well, you notice when we looked at the introduction of wolves that before wolves were present, the average fat storage of the moose was really low. Okay, so let's just say it was about 10.2. Whereas whenever wolves were present, the average fat stores of the moose was a lot higher. Let's just say it was like 58.71. So remember, in wild populations, having more fat is more beneficial. It means you're healthier because you can now reproduce better, you have the energy to reproduce, and you can survive through the winter better. So why does the presence of wolves increase the health of populations? One thing that might be obvious to you is that wolves lower the moose population, right? So if there's more wolves present, there's less moose present, so there's more vegetation for the remaining moose that are there. So this allows them to gain more fat. Another thing that I wanted to point out here is that wolves feed on the weaker individuals. So they're going to only allow the healthy moose to survive and reproduce, and therefore it's going to make the population as a whole healthier. Predators do not go after the strongest individuals in a population. They'll usually take out the weaker individuals in that population. So looking at what we've talked about so far, there's three main relationships that you should be able to understand and be able to interpret the graphs of these relationships. So let's look at this first figure here. What is going on here between these two species? Well, notice one species is reaching a carrying capacity, but if you look at the other species, it's increasing and then the population is decreasing. So what we can see here is that this is showing the competitive exclusion principle. So competitive exclusion is happening here. What this indicates is that these species probably have very similar niches. Their environment is probably very homogeneous, which means the environment is very uniform, right? So they're living in a very uniform environment and they're both competing for the exact same resources. If we look at a graph like this, we can see that these two populations are oscillating. We just saw an example of this. This is an example of a predator-prey relationship. We know that the predator is this dotted line because notice it lags behind the prey population. And also, it's slightly lower than the prey population. Finally, what is happening in this last figure? Do these two species have similar niches? Well, they wouldn't be able to coexist if they had very similar niches. So these two species are coexisting, so they most likely, in this case, would have very different niches. And so they're not competing with each other. Objective 5 says, describe the general form of ecological pyramids. So an ecological pyramid, we kind of talked about this already when we talked about predator and prey relationships, but this shows the relative biomass of each trophic level in an ecosystem. You can see, based on this image down here, that producers have a lot more biomass, followed by the primary consumers, then the secondary consumers, and the tertiary consumers have the least amount of biomass. When I'm talking about biomass, I'm talking about the total mass of a group of organisms in a given area. So for example, let's just say I went to a certain forest and I went to this forest patch and I wanted to measure the biomass of the producers. What I'd have to do is I have to collect all the photosynthesizers in that forest patch and weigh them and look at their biomass. And you would notice that that biomass is much greater than if I went in there and I collected all the primary consumers. All right. The reason that this occurs is that there's more energy available for lower trophic levels. And as we move from one feeding level to the next, we actually lose a lot of energy. All right, so as I go from producers to primary consumers, only about 10 to 15% of the energy that went into the producers is actually transferred to the next level. And only 10 to 15% of the energy that went into the primary consumers is actually transferred to the secondary consumers. So we're losing energy as we move through the different trophic levels. So if you look at this diagram here, you can see that the sun might provide, for example, 1,000 joules of light energy to the plants. However, of that 1,000 joules of energy that goes into the plants, only about 10 joules of energy is available for the herbivores. What happens to the rest of the energy? Well, most of it, about 90% of it, is lost into the environment. So what happens to the energy that is lost? In order to understand this, let's look at an example here. So let's look at this tiny little mouse. So this mouse consumes a lot of food. And only about 10 to 15% of the energy that's consumed by this mouse is actually available for the predator. So what happened to that other 90% of the energy that that mouse consumed? Well, as that mouse uses that energy, most of it is actually being lost as metabolic heat. So about 90% of its loss is metabolic heat. Also, a small percentage of it is also being lost as indigestible material in the feces from that mouse. Objective 6 says compare and contrast the movement of energy and of matter through ecosystems. So based on what we just talked about, one thing I want to focus on here is that energy and matter move through an ecosystem very differently from each other. Energy only flows in one direction and it is not recycled. So where does all the energy come from in an ecosystem? So if you look at this diagram here, the red lines are showing the movement of energy. Notice that all energy comes from the sun. Without the sun, there would be no energy for an ecosystem to survive. We would not be able to survive without the sun. Plants are able to take that energy from the sun and they are able to capture it and convert it into chemical energy. And then consumers can consume that chemical energy for their own source of energy to do stuff. Whenever consumers die, there's a little bit of chemical energy left, and then that is broken down by decomposers and used by decomposers. And then by the end, there's no more energy left in that system. So energy only flows in one direction, and most of that energy is actually lost to the environment, and it cannot be recycled. Whereas when we're talking about matter, we're talking about the actual chemical or the actual atoms that make up everything. The actual matter is recycled in an ecosystem. What trophic level is responsible for this recycling is the decomposers. So decomposers break down things that die, and they break down those chemicals into really simple forms so that producers can take those chemicals and rebuild larger molecules from them. So then we can just keep this cycle of chemicals going through an ecosystem. Let's do a quick sample question here before I get into some more sample questions. But this one's really important because it's, I think, one of the trickiest sample questions that I have ever seen on an exam. So here it says there are 4 equal-sized ponds in a forest, and they all contain an insect-eating fish. The number of fish in each pond is indicated by the following figure. Which pond has a greater biomass of insects? So the pictures are showing us the number of insect-eating fish in each pond and which one has the greatest biomass of insects. Every time I ask students this question, about 50% of the students will say C and 50% of them will say D. And I'm going to tell you right now that D is correct. And D is correct because of this thing that we talked about with biomass, right? In order for there to be more fish in this pond, there needs to be more insects to sustain that higher fish population. So D is correct here. So when you're reading a question like this, think about what we've been talking about in class and think about the pyramid of biomass that we were talking about. All right, so let's do some sample questions. The galago lives in warm climates, leading a relatively solitary life where it hunts for insects at night. Name one abiotic component of the galago's niche. So remember that abiotic, A means not, bio means living, so it means not living. So what's one not living component or non-living component of the galago's niche? Well, if we look here, what are some things that they talk about? So warm temperatures would be an important part of its niche. What else do you see here? When it's active only at night. So some answers you could have put down here would be that it's nocturnal or active at night, and that it also requires warm temperatures to live. The next question says, the figure at the right shows population growth in Arctic seals, the main food source for polar bears. At what point would the polar bear population most likely have an R value that is less than 1? If the prey population is at its lowest point, then the predator population is probably also decreasing at that point. So I would say C. And that is what the answer is. The predator population lags behind the prey, so when the prey population reaches its lowest point, the predator population still has not reached its lowest point quite yet. So it's decreasing at that time. So the next question says, why are there usually more hares than lynx in an ecosystem? So if we look here, we can see that the snowshoe hare population tends to be higher than the lynx population. So why is this? This is because the lynx, or in other words, the secondary consumers, are in a higher trophic level. So that means they have less biomass or less energy available to them than hares, which are the primary consumers. So lower trophic levels tend to have a higher biomass. The following graph shows the interaction between a primary consumer and a secondary consumer. Which organism, A or B, is the predator? The correct answer here is B. 2 reasons you would know that answer. One is that, notice, line B is lagging behind line A. The predator population always lags behind the prey. Second, the predator population is usually smaller than the prey population. The next question says, moles prey on grubs that eat the roots of Bermuda grass. Which of the following graphs best represents the relationship you would expect between the population size of moles and grubs? Correct answer here would be C. We know that this is a predator-prey relationship, so they would oscillate with each other or asynchronously from each other. Name the specific trophic level of the grubs. Well, it says that the grubs eat Bermuda grass, so the grubs would be primary consumers. Identify the trophic level of each of the following organisms and indicate which trophic level has the highest biomass. So here we have the coyote, dandelion, and rabbit. Well, since the coyote feeds on the rabbit that feeds on the dandelion, coyotes are secondary consumers, and they're going to have the lowest biomass because they have the highest trophic level in this feeding relationship here. Dandelions are producers, so they're going to have the highest biomass because they have the lowest trophic level, and rabbits would be primary consumers. The next question says, many fungi secrete enzymes which break down dead organic matter so it can be absorbed by their cells. What is the name of the trophic level of these fungi? The trick here is that it's saying that they feed on dead things. And we know that anything that feeds on a dead thing is a decomposer. The tomato hornworm is a giant green caterpillar that feeds on the leaves of tomato plants. A parasitoid wasp lays its eggs on the hornworm's body. When these eggs hatch, the young wasps feed on the body of the hornworm, causing its death. Name the trophic level of the young wasps. So here is a giant green caterpillar, and you can see here the parasitic wasp eggs that are attached to the caterpillar, and then they will actually feed on the caterpillar. So it's pretty gruesome there. What is the trophic level of these wasps? Well, the wasps would actually be secondary consumers in this case. Habitats A and B both contain 3 herbivore species and 2 carnivore species, but the producer biomass differs. The following pyramids of biomass show the producer trophic level in each habitat. Which habitat, A or B, has a higher carrying capacity for carnivores? The correct answer is B. Since B has a higher biomass of producers, it could support a higher biomass of carnivores. Hognose snakes have a very special diet consisting almost entirely of toads. If you studied an area occupied by hognose snakes and toads, would you expect the snake biomass to be larger, smaller, or the same as a toad biomass? Well, the snake biomass would be smaller because they are a higher trophic level. The following figure shows the relationship between a population of zebras and a population of tigers. Which of the following statements is supported by this graph? Pause the video and then I will give you the answer. The correct answer is B. The prey population begins to decrease after the predator population increases. And that is the end of the review for Unit 11.